Welcome, my friend George LaPrey, to the Expert Witness Radio Show. You're on the stand now. You raise your right hand, please. And
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
You know, let me go back. I've got to go back to back during the Vietnam War. I was sent undercover into Bangkok in Cambodia to actually, I ended up living with some heroin dealers in that area and doing a drug deal and finding out more than I ever wanted to know, actually, about how our government was run. And the most chilling experience I had was hanging out with two GIs who were on R&R in Bangkok from Vietnam. Because these two men were crazed, totally crazed. They brought me in and out. Of course, I wasn't very normal than myself, or I wouldn't have been involved in some of this stuff. But that experience, one day we'll go into depth about that experience, kind of made me identify with, I'm an ex-military too at that point, identify with that Vietnam experience, thinking about men that crazed, that fearless for their lives, who... I don't know. They're not people that you want to piss off. They're not people that you want to be up on the front line with who have weapons, because you understand I came to understand how fragile life is, how quick it is, how a wrong word can end in death and every kind of horrific event you could imagine. And you seem to run smack into this. Just first begin with telling us what got you so involved, because you devoted a lot of time, a lot of your life to the study of fragging in Vietnam. What was it that attracted you, and then take us into your experience in putting this book together?
Well, I'd been reading books about Vietnam since I was in high school, and then when I entered the military in the 1980s, a lot of the Vietnam guys were still around. I mean, you guys were our bosses, basically. The senior non-commissioned officers and the field grade officers on up had all served over there. And serving with them kind of got me even more interested. And the more I read, the more, I developed my interest in the war. And the early books that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, I mean, they might mention fragging and provide like a short definition of what it was, but they didn't make any attempt at or any effort at what I'd call an authoritative examination of the subject. I mean, there were some books that would suggest that fraggings were common occurrences. There were others who wouldn't say anything about it at all. And so when it came time to choose a topic, whenever I see something out there that kind of piques my interest and there's not enough information out there about it, then that's when I'm off to the archives. And that's what really got me started on this subject.
And if you had to say what was the primary cause, I mean, from reading your book, what it seems to me? It seems to me that you're saying that the race wars within the U.S. at the time were mirrored in Vietnam at the same time, but in a very bloody fashion of fragging and those kinds of incidents, shootings. Am I wrong in getting that feeling from the book?
Well, there are several causes. Race does happen to be one of them. It's just in 1968, two pivotal events happened. First, right after the Tet Offensive, President Johnson got on television and, he made that famous speech on March 31st when he said he wouldn't, seek re-election. And he spoke about, negotiations to end the fighting. So basically what that told the troops was, why would you exert yourself? Why would you risk your life? We're going to disengage. The war is going to end without a decisive result. And then secondly, was the assassination of Martin Luther King just a few days later.
Yeah.
In 1965-66, during the build-up years in Vietnam, there were almost no racial incidents over there. There were no problems among the different soldiers of different races in Vietnam. But then after King was assassinated, that changed the story.
You also point out that there was a decline in the I hate to use the word quality, but I'm using that for lack of a better term, in the quality of person that was brought into the military. And
Right.
You also talk about an explosion of the rate of fragging having to do with the slow withdrawal from Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that some?
Well, it's just as the war went on and on, the military had a hard time attracting quality personnel. You know, you had a lot of people went to college, you know, and attained student deferments. They didn't want to have anything to do with the war, and so ROTC students, you know, they were there basically to avoid the thing. They knew that the reserves and National Guard weren't going to be called up and sent over there. And so the people who normally would enter the military, who were, you know, would score on the higher rungs of the Armed Forces qualification test weren't available. And so what had to happen was the military lowered their standards. The most notable example was in the Army. You know, they had people who would go to basic training, and if they did well in basic training, they would immediately send the trainee to a non-commissioned officer course. And so you had people who were in the Army 6 months, 7 months who were sergeants already.
Yeah.
And, I mean, when I was in the Army in the 1980s, I mean, my platoon sergeant was in his late 30s, early 40s. I mean, I had one fragging case in Vietnam where a 20-year-old platoon sergeant was murdered. I mean, it's just you had a lot of people who were promoted to advanced ranks at very young ages.
Now, was that? Do you think that was a reaction to their mishandling of people below them?
Well, I mean, it may be the perceived mishandling.
Right.
If you have someone who is recruited into the military from the criminal justice system, and some of the fraggers in my study were, you know, they're prone to blame their problems on others. And so whether it was that NCO or officer's fault or not, it didn't matter. They'd blame them anyway.
Right. Now, what about the huge rise in fragging incidents directly relating to the slow withdrawal?
Well, what happened was when they heard that Vietnamization was going to begin, you know, everyone assumed that it would be out of there in, you know, maybe a few weeks or months. But then when Vietnamization, you know, started in 1969 and stretched into 1970 into 71. Before long, you had people who were barely in high school when President Johnson made his withdrawal speech in March of 1968, and here they are over there. And so this, you know, when's it going to end? We know just about everybody's home. You know, more and more soldiers are being withdrawn, and yet I'm still over here. It's still 100 degrees. I'm still away from home, and I still have this, you know, perceived harassment from one of my superiors, and that's what led to it.
Yeah. And when you combine it with what you were talking about, Mike, about that crazed aspect, because it obviously wasn't orderly over there.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. Not only from these two guys who I was hanging out drinking with in along what they call Sukhumvit in Bangkok, which was a strip where all the GIs, all the bars were, and some of them owned by ex-GIs, who, by the way, went into the drug business. You know, yeah, they were. Yeah, you know, it's a whole other story. But the impression I got from these guys is, who gives an F? You know, we're going back, and what's the difference? And, you know, kind of crazy me, dumb way, I went along with that because, well, I was an undercover agent, first of all, and hanging out with these guys, it was just another role for me, but it almost ended up as a deadly role because these two got the three of us in trouble in a Thai bar that almost ended with you know, us being impaled on about a dozen knives. And no, I'm serious, Mark. You know, it's one of those. You know, I look back over my life at times, and in the middle of the night, I wake up and think, "Holy mackerel! Thank you, God, that I'm here with my wife still." You know, and this is one of the events was with these guys. But then there was the drug aspect too. They were looking to. They didn't know it, but I was an undercover agent, you know, making drug connections, and they were looking for dope connections themselves right there in Bangkok. I want to read from your book here, and I want to give the listeners an understanding of why I got this perception that the race war played a huge part in the fragging incident, and unless I'm taking this too out of context, Camp Radcliffe was a large U.S. base. This is from page 107 in the book. We're talking about, again, by the way, for you guys listening, Fragging. This is mandatory. The book is Fragging by George LaPrey. Why U.S. soldiers assaulted their officers in Vietnam. Camp Radcliffe was a large U.S. base located in Kon Tum province, the site of some of the war's fiercest battles. By 1971, much of the local fighting involved not the Viet Cong, but blacks and whites of C Troop, the 10th Cavalry, a unit that had won fame in the previous century as an all-black Buffalo regiment in the North American plains. And you go on to really describe a situation where it forget the guys with guns out in front of you. You had, if you were in that particular camp, and if I'm wrong, that kind of attitude or that feeling seems to prevail throughout the book. Am I wrong? Let's talk first of all about your experience with Camp Radcliffe, and put the lie to my impression that without the race aspect, the racial war aspect going on in the United States at the same, as you pointed out, to the assassination of Martin Luther King, and I think also a week before that or so, Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. So you've got this wildness going on in the U.S. that seems to be mirrored right there. And go ahead, take it away, George. Let me know what your thoughts are about what I just said.
During the previous, 1940s, 1950s, the United States had to deal with a number of serious social issues. For example, in 1948, President Truman, integrated the armed forces, and there wasn't much turmoil when that happened because the Army's junior and senior NCO Corps and the officer corps were able to socialize the guys and maintain high discipline standards. That's why there wasn't much trouble. However, during Vietnam, during the later years of the war, because most of the NCOs, the sergeants and the junior officers had already been over in Vietnam once, twice, some even three times. By 1969, 1970, these men had either completed their tours and retired or left the military or had been killed or wounded. Their places were taken by increasingly younger men with less experience and less maturity. So they couldn't maintain the high discipline levels. Now, in the case of Camp Radcliffe, when Captain Reichert was murdered, that was just a unit that was at war with itself. And that troop commander was killed. And anyway, that was that month, January 1971, when that happened. He was the second officer to be murdered in that way. There was a major who was killed in another shooting incident nearby. So, with that, I mean, in previous eras, I guess it's best to say that the military was able to socialize these problems, and they were able to have maintain high enough discipline that they didn't have any trouble during the social phenomena like integration. But by the time Martin Luther King was assassinated, that was no longer the case, and as you see the incidents they had, like Captain Reichert's murder.
Yeah, but you paint an almost Mad Max scenario. You've got a gang, you call them, functioning, and nobody really doing anything about it. What you describe as a black power gang formed in Camp Radcliffe. And what did you interview any of the people who were there during?
I spoke with the guy who was, I believe he was the unit armorer, but he was a junior NCO in the unit. And the guy who came and replaced him said, what happened to the last commander? Oh, they shot him. But
I mean, it's hard to imagine. You're a military man, so am I. It's just hard to imagine the kind of feeling that puts in you. But go ahead, and why do I get the impression that was just a powerful factor throughout the whole Army after we pretty much after Lyndon Johnson's famous speech when he decided not to run, and the soldiers knew they're backing out, and that anybody dying from that point on would be a complete wasted for nothing death.